If you're somebody who knows anything about Spider-Man games, you are more than likely familiar with one Spider-Man game in particular, Spider-Man 2, based on the 2004 movie Spider-Man 2, starring Tobey Maguire. And you know, why wouldn't you be? This game has stood the test of time. It's still fun to play even to this day. A+, I love it. This game is so good, and when I played it as a kid, I couldn't get enough of it. So much so, that when I was like 12 years old, I sold it at a garage sale. And then years later after that, when I was 19, I realized how stupid of a decision that was, and bought the game again off of Amazon. Then, I ended up playing it with Dolphin anyway. Money well spent. Anyway, with that entirely unnecessary anecdote out of the way, allow me to bring us towards our topic of discussion. So here goes. While Spider-Man 2 is indeed a wonderful game that deserves the praise it gets even to this day, I feel it largely overshadows the other two Spider-Man movie games. You know, nobody really talks about them all that much, which I think is a shame. Spider-Man 3 is kind of infamous for a certain, moment.
I'm going to die!
But besides that, I don't really see people talking about it all that much, or the first game. So that's where I come in. I want to spend this video talking about my personal favorite of the three games, Spider-Man 1, the movie, the game, on the original Xbox starring Tobey Maguire. And yes, it's on PlayStation 2 and the GameCube as well, but the Xbox version is what I grew up playing, so that's what we're gonna roll with. Plus, the Xbox version has some exclusive extra content included, but we'll get more into that later. So, the way I'm gonna go about this, whatever this is, gushing about a Spider-Man game I guess, is I'm going to discuss a lot of the mechanics of this game and how it feels to play overall, discuss how it deviates from the actual movie itself, the sort of experience you can expect to get out of it, and even show off how some parts of this game eventually evolve and improve in later Spider-Man games, namely the new Insomniac one. And no, Spider-Man 1 was not the first to do some of the things I'm going to mention, but that's not really what this is about. I just want to talk about why I like this game. I don't think there's any harm in that. Anyway, without further ado, now, if you ask me, one of the very first things that come to mind when I think about Spider-Man are his iconic methods of traversal. Getting from point A to point B. Web swinging, the classic, and web swinging's best friend, wall crawling. Not to mention all the crazy acrobatics, you know how it is. Movement and agility are what make Spider-Man who he is, that of course being a man bitten by a spider hyped up on super cocaine. It's a very natural first step in analyzing a game about him, I feel. So how about we get into it? How does Spider-Man, the movie, the game, starring Tobey Maguire, handle movement? Well, let's start with the web swinging. It's one of the first things you can do on the first level outside of the tutorial, as it should be. That, and jumping to your goddamn doom if that's what you're after, but let's assume you don't want to do that. You are immediately met with a gorgeous view of New York City skyscrapers, absolutely begging to be swung on. You press the right trigger and away you go. Now, as you can immediately notice, this is not what the cool kids consider real web swinging. You don't need to actually connect to anything in order to move forward. Spidey just kinda shoots his web into the sky and lets his faith in the Lord carry him forward. Now, that's not to say it's completely mindless. There is some semblance of depth as far as your swinging options go. If you hold the right trigger after starting a swing, you go significantly faster. It's a bit hard to control, like Peter's been hitting the bottle cabinet a little bit, but it's good if you're just trying to get somewhere quickly, or if you're chasing around an airborne enemy and need to catch up. Especially with the Green Goblin, so it has its uses. You can also break the web line by holding backwards on the control stick, jumping, and pressing the right trigger again to do an instant 180-degree turn. This has pretty limited uses. Once again, if an enemy gets behind you suddenly while you're swinging, you can do the turn to find them quickly, but this is really the only use it's any good for. It also works in any other direction besides going a full 180, which by proxy makes the fast swinging a lot easier to control too. All in all, this is about the extent to which the web swinging mechanics are implemented in this game. No swing speed upgrades, no super advanced moves, nothing more than it really needed to be. Which would be a lot more disappointing if this were, you know, Spider-Man 2, but it's not. As a matter of fact, this first level is the most you'll do any web swinging in the entire game, as the rest of it mostly takes place indoors. Warehouses, sewers, office buildings, I could go on. And yeah, technically there is nothing really stopping you from hitting the right trigger during any of these points, but you are not going to get a whole lot out of it most of the times you try. However, sometimes it can make for a pretty good quick getaway to go find some health or web pickups if you're in trouble, assuming the room you're in at the time is big enough. The compass and height meter, which tell you what direction and how far up or down your objectives are in each level respectively, are both made fairly useless because of this as well, since all of the interior levels are pretty linear, save for an extra room or hallway here and there. So how does this game get around this sort of web-swinging limitation? Well, I'm glad you ask, and I've got 2 words for you. Well, 4 words, 2 phrases. Let's wall climbing, obviously, and web zipping. Wall climbing is exactly what you think it is. It's one of the many things that Spider-Man does that a spider, in fact, can. You walk up to a wall, push towards it a little bit, and look at that. You're like a fucking cryptid just hiding in the corner of a room. Or a spider. Imagine that. Transferring between the floor and the wall is completely automatic, and it works reasonably well most of the time. Heavy emphasis on most of the time, because I'd be lying if I said it sometimes doesn't make for some, fascinating gameplay moments.
I don't have time for this. I've got to find the switch to shut off the power.
But yeah, there are plenty of opportunities for using it. It comes with its advantages when it comes to exploration and combat, and the levels in this game actually do feel pretty well thought out when it comes to how effective wall climbing actually ends up being. We'll get a little more into that in a minute. For now, let's quickly address the second ability I listed. In fact, this is one of my personal favorite parts of the game, web zipping. Web zipping is a very quick, one-button command that you can execute at any point in time, provided there is something to actually web zip to. Its main function, at least as I have come to understand, is to quickly and easily help you evade danger, and stop yourself from getting killed when a bunch of guys gain up on you and start filling your ass with lead. And there you go. Later, dickheads. Also, if you're feeling especially ambitious, there is a bit of a more advanced way of performing web zips. If you click the right stick while standing still, you'll get a spider-shaped reticle on your screen that you can point around wherever you like, and it changes colors between red and green. So get this right, when you point it somewhere, and it changes green, you can press the web zip button and you'll right on over to wherever you were pointing the reticle. It's not something you need to use extremely often, but it is a really nice tool to have at your disposal in a few specific use cases, especially on things like stealth sections. Speaking of which, this game has stealth sections. Who would have guessed? Motherfucker climbs on the ceiling, so you better believe he's gonna use that to his advantage. These sections are relatively interesting ways to play through some levels if you choose to do so, even if they are few and far between. Wall climbing and web zipping are very much your friends here. The game gives you a fancy little stealth icon so you can keep track of whether or not your enemies can see you. Full color when you're visible, and a dark bluish color when you're not. Pretty straightforward. These are the points where you're going to be using crawling and zipping the most out of anywhere else in the game. Nearly all of the shadowed areas where you can hide in darkness are up in the walls and ceilings, and the areas themselves are pretty isolated, so they more so act as kind of like little hiding spots. So the key to successful stealth is through a combination of using wall climbing to actually hide up in the shadowy dark spots, along with using web zipping to easily move between the spots that you find. The visual difference between what is considered hidden and what is not is fairly clear, so navigation isn't too difficult. Stealth comes with a few caveats though. There are sections of the game that are substantially easier to play through when you practice not being seen. That much is very evident. However, the problem is that it is nearly impossible to actually remain in stealth for very long moments at a time, let alone entire levels. As a matter of fact, I have not been able to get through a single level of this game without being caught at least once or twice, even on the levels that I would consider to be the quote-unquote stealth levels. Theoretically, it may be possible, sure, but I don't think it's really going to happen without a heaping amount of luck on your side. Eventually, the whole stealth concept was pretty much abandoned in Spider-Man 2, but it does make a return eventually in the 2018 Spider-Man game, trading out hiding in the shadows for just staying higher up above your enemies on catwalks and poles and stuff. Gets a lot more refined here, obviously, and would you look at that, there's even web zipping. So you're fulfilling the Spider-Man role for real now, doing flips and web swinging and shit. Cool. Not gonna do you much good though if you don't know how to deal some good old-fashioned justice. You've been blessed with these insane super spider abilities and by God you're gonna use them. I think I'm starting to sound like Bruce Campbell.
Ready to dish out some old-fashioned justice?
Well, let's just start off by going ahead and seeing what happens when you press X. Holy fuck. Okay, so on a more serious note, I actually do quite enjoy this game's combat. It's a little clunky, especially compared to what we would eventually get in Spider-Man 2, but I think it's a lot of fun in spite of this. You press X 3 times to do a punch combo, as seen here, and you press B 3 times to do a kick combo.
Yeah, kick him in the dick.
But you know, what if you want to do a little bit more than just a basic ass punch and kick? Well, this is where the combo moves come in. Brand spanking new ways of sending your enemies into their coffins. Do you want to punch a gang member so hard on the chin that it gets launched upwards? Spidey does like a fucking 360-degree spin and elbows him straight into the stomach, launching him like 15 feet away, likely causing him to go into a coma? Yeah, you can do that. Do you want to goddamn kick one in the head, do a backflip like 10 feet, and then launch both of your legs forward into his face and crush his skull? Yeah, sure, why not? These aren't combo moves, they are Mortal Kombat fatalities. You're fucking Spider-Man. Elbowing this man in the stomach in midair, hard enough to send him flying in the other direction, is going to kill him. His stomach acid is leaking and melting him from the inside. Look at him fucking dissolve. There are a plethora of unlockable combo moves that you can collect throughout the game. They are responsive and fairly easy to use, provided you can, like, remember them all. And by that, I mean there are a shocking amount of them. Throughout each level of the game, there are multiple hidden golden spider emblems you can collect that each add a new super flashy move to Spider-Man's skill set. They are decently hidden too. I've honestly never been able to find them all by myself in any playthrough I've done of this game. As a matter of fact, here's a quick shot of all the ones I did manage to get my hands on. As you can see, it isn't a whole lot, although for the purposes of this video, I didn't spend a whole lot of time looking for them. That aside, I actually think this is a really fun way of acquiring something like combo moves in a video game. It's not super conventional, unlike, I don't know, getting them in a skill tree or something. Or maybe buying them in a store. It gives you a nice incentive to explore the area around you a little bit more than you otherwise probably would, and I think that's a lot of fun. Also, this isn't an unlockable combo move, nor is it mentioned anywhere in the game at all as far as I can tell, but if you press the Y button while you're in the middle of a web zip, you'll get like a force field kind of thing around you that hurts enemies. It's cool, albeit very impractical, and it uses a fuck ton of web to do, but I figured it was worth bringing up. Overall, the combat system is a little bit clunky, but I think it works well for what it is. Enemies also have some decent variation themselves. Some punch, some block more than others, some shoot, you know, the basics. Also, I cannot go to my next point without mentioning the stupid one-liners they tend to drop. It's times like when I've just got done beating one enemy into a bloody pulp, and I look over and see the very next one walking up to me, and he has the audacity to go,
"What you doing up here, pencil neck?"
It's at that moment where I just can't help but feel a sense of pure joy. So as you can probably imagine, this game, like most other games, contains a story. Yeah, shocking, right? And as you might also have guessed, the story in this game mainly revolves around the events of the Spider-Man movie, starring Tobey Maguire. You may notice my deliberate use of the word mainly, and allow me to elaborate. The game starts off pretty much right away with the aftermath surrounding Uncle Ben's death, with Peter searching for the killer. This brings us to the very first level, where Spidey's main goal is to go around town interrogating local Skull Gang members, in an effort to learn the name of Uncle Ben's killer and where he is hiding. And interrogating is a very generous word here.
They didn't know anything, but I'm just getting started.
Once he has all that figured out, you immediately move on to the second level, which sees you searching through a warehouse for the killer's whereabouts. Finally, you approach the third level with a bit more searching, finally finding the killer and facing off with him in a little boss fight. So far so good. You defeat him, get a little cutscene of his capture, another cutscene with some exposition narrated by Uncle Ben, then you do a little training level to learn about the game's lock-on system, and then immediately afterwards you go straight to Grand Central Station to chase around Shocker through some subway levels. So yeah, let's address that. The thing is, the vast majority of the story in Spider-Man, the movie, the game, starring Tobey Maguire, is original content, which probably isn't that big of a surprise to you if you've played either of the other two games. There are of course only a couple hours of movie content to begin with, so they have to figure out some way to extend the gameplay a little bit. It's laid out in a sort of episodic format, with each episode featuring its own particular supervillain. The general setup consists of one level where you're chasing or following the villain in question, followed by a level or two you need to traverse while avoiding a multitude of traps or fighting through enemy encounters. And after all that, you finally reach the boss level where you face off against the supervillain. And in between each of these supervillain stories, you get a level or two following the main overarching plot. featuring the Green Goblin and, well, not like the actual movie plot, but something that could be misconstrued as possibly resembling the movie plot. You know, I don't recall Spidey going toe-to-toe against one of the fucking mechs from Pacific Rim, but who am I to comment on that? Now, don't get me wrong here. Even with all the extra supervillains involved, they obviously have to stretch the story of the movie a fair amount to actually get a game out of it. It's just kind of fascinating, if not entertaining to me, how far it actually goes. Going back to the supervillains I mentioned a minute ago, I have to say the ones you face off against are actually really cool. I've personally always had a pretty big interest in both Shocker and Vulture especially, and I think that stems almost 100% from this game alone. Scorpion is also in this game, but frankly he probably has the most forgettable segment of all of them. You fight some robot spiders that can be a bitch to deal with if you get overwhelmed, and I think this is the only level where you can actually lift up and throw cars, which is pretty fun, but besides that, there isn't a ton to write home about here. Something that is worth writing home about though is the inclusion of Kraven the Hunter. Kraven's Nest, as it's called, is one of my absolute favorite segments. It's so unique compared to a lot of the rest of the game. Kraven's whole gimmick is that he's a hunter, right? Hence his name. So he is an expert at laying traps and hunting for the spider, as he calls it. You have to avoid spikes, bear traps, some more comical traps like swinging logs and flamethrowers. There's even a really cool sniper segment that you control from the perspective of Kraven. It's really goddamn cool. It's also a bit of a shame though, because if you remember me hinting at this near the beginning of the video, Kraven's entire set of levels is actually only available on the Xbox version of the game. I honestly did not even know this was the case until like 2 or 3 years ago when I played the game on Twitch. I just remember arriving at the final levels and being completely perplexed that I hadn't seen Kraven at all.
Wait, what the hell? That's the last level.
Let's do this.
No, wait, what? The game skipped Kraven. There's like a huge section of the game we just missed. Hold on. What the fuck?
I was playing the GameCube version of the game at the time, and after some quick Google searching I found out he's just simply not on there. So if you do happen to have played this game as a kid like I did, but did so on the PlayStation 2 or the GameCube and don't remember seeing Kraven yourself, that's the reason why. With all that said, I suppose I cannot close out this section without talking about the big bad bitch himself, the Green Goblin. Of course he is in this game. It wouldn't be Spider-Man the movie, the game, starring Tobey Maguire without him. Or I guess, more accurately, starring Willem Dafoe. Because they actually got him to do the voice in this game, it's really great.
Me? I'm just a concerned citizen helping to clean up our fair city.
Goblin makes his first appearance after the fight with Shocker. He wreaks a little havoc here and there. Then he goes,
You haven't seen the last of me, Spider-Man.
and then you head on over to the next thing. Rinse and repeat until he fucking dies. As for actually fighting him, the majority of the fights take place in the air, with him on his glider and you swinging on your Spidey web ropes. Hey, that balloon tutorial was a pretty smart idea. He does drop down for some ground combat a couple of times, namely during his last phases, and at that point it's just more or less like most of the ground enemies. He punches, he kicks, he throws bombs and shit, but just use some of your combos that you collected, and you'll be a-okay. Most of the time. There are a decent amount of minigames and other challenges to play through in the specials menu, with the ones available to you right away being the training modes. Combat training, swing training, and zip training, naturally. Combat training is actually a lot of fun, if not a bit difficult. It takes place in a wrestling ring with a cage around the sides, like the scene from the movie, which is already a nice touch. The way it works is you spawn in, maybe check out the little question mark to listen to more Bruce Campbell, and then the enemies start to spawn in alongside you. It starts off with 1 or 2 enemies at a time, beginning with the basic gang members that don't do much besides act like your punching bag. And as you beat more and more of them, you are gradually given more difficult enemies in higher numbers, all the way up to 4 enemies per wave. This challenge doesn't feel especially difficult when you first get into it, but I was pretty surprised to find myself getting overwhelmed and dying before being able to finish the mode. You don't even get any kind of health or web pickups at all throughout the entire match, so it is pretty difficult doing it the intended way. That said, if you really want to beat it, you can get away with just kinda sticking to the ceiling the entire time and chip away each enemy's health by web yanking them back and forth. It takes nearly 0 web resources to do this, so even when the meter is basically empty, the small amount of webbing that automatically replenishes itself is more than enough to web yank every other second or so. And if you do make it all the way to the end, you are rewarded with a fight against the wrestler Bonesaw from the movie too. He doesn't appear anywhere else in the game besides here, so the fact that they put a unique boss at the end of this particular training mode is, you know, something they didn't have to do, but it makes me happy knowing that they did. He even has voice acting and everything.
Having fun yet?
I'm gonna snap you like a twig!
There is also a sort of second combat training mode actually, although it is probably more appropriate to call it a challenge mode instead. It is called the Big Brawl. The concept is fairly similar to the combat training mode, where you face off against waves of enemies in an arena, but with a couple of key differences. The arena is much, much larger, with enough room to swing around comfortably, and the enemy variation is far wider. In fact, none of the enemies in combat training even appear here. Most of the enemies, like the spiders and these things called hunter-killers, are in the story mode at one point or another. However, there are a couple of unique enemy types only in this mode as well. The first and most notable of which are these, I guess, androids of some kind? They have robotic voices, but human-like bodies, so you know, your guess is as good as mine here. I don't know if the Dragon Ball Z rules really apply. They don't do anything particularly special, they're pretty much just more agile versions of the Skull Gang thugs from the beginning of the game, but with a little less health. There are also these, Metal Gear. Now, when you factor in everything I've mentioned thus far, it all adds up to the Big Brawl being a pretty formidable challenge. I've personally never beaten it, though that may be due to the fact that it becomes a bit of a clusterfuck the longer you survive. The hunter-killers are especially good at surrounding you and doing absolutely ridiculous amounts of damage at once. The android dudes are also occasionally given guns to shoot at you with, and while they aren't very good shots, they can catch you by surprise if you aren't careful. And I know I kinda glossed over them, but the Metal Gears that I just mentioned are really effective damage sponges, so that's another thing you have to deal with. All in all, it's just another fun little extra thing you can do in the game. Unfortunately, you don't get a reward for getting all the way through this one though. All you are given is a celebratory "you win" screen. But if that's all you want, then who am I to judge? On the other end of things, we also have the previously mentioned swing training. There are 3 levels to it: Basic, Advanced, and Expert, with each tier being a little more difficult than the last. They're pretty straightforward, you swing through some corridors and around some obstacles, and the only real goal is to reach this ominous green box at the end in the shortest time you can. It's legitimately challenging, but that may be largely due to the fact that the web swinging and overall maneuverability of Spider-Man in this game is, well, as I mentioned before, pretty clunky. Web zipping is also disabled during this mode, so you can't use it to aid you in any way. That's not to say you can't still learn to do pretty well in these challenges. I was able to beat the best time in most of them, it just takes a little bit of persistence. Of course, they couldn't have a dedicated swing training mode without also having a zip training mode. It's basically the same thing as the swing training, same aesthetic and all that, but with the courses built for, well, web zipping. Imagine that. It's not really any easier or harder than the swing training, but it is a little bit more difficult to tell where you're going, largely due to the nature of how zipping works in this game. It's still pretty fun though. As awkward as aiming it can be, the web zipping is quick and responsive, and it's genuinely satisfying to achieve a really fast time at the end of each course. And the same can be said about the swing training. Also, as a little bonus, in each level of both modes, Bruce Campbell shows up again to give you his little spiel about what you're doing and what the goal of each level is.
Looks like you're ready to take zip training to the next level, big shot. Well, you asked for it.
Again, please, just put him back in modern Spider-Man games. It's a complete and utter disservice to all of us to not have him included. Anyway, we are getting a little off track, so let me finish off the training modes with the last one of them all. It's not a specific mode like swinging or zipping, it's simply referred to as the obstacle course. When I was first coming up with the concept of this video, this goddamn gauntlet of a level was one of the very first memories I recalled from playing this as a child, and I think it may have done permanent damage to me. The obstacle course is a horrifying mess of platforms, columns, and walls, and you are allowed to use any combination of web swinging and zipping to make your way through it. The catch, though, is if you happen to accidentally run into any floor, platform, wall, whatever, you get 5 seconds added to your time. Which, when the goal is to get a low time, is obviously not any good. The best time set up for you in the beginning is 1 minute, and the best I was willing to subject myself to was 1:15, which, I don't even know how the fuck I pulled that off. What's even more impressive is how I managed to scrape by with only 3 collisions, because every time I've tried since then, I've gotten a minimum of like... Yeah. It sucks even more because you can accidentally get stuck on a wall, which counts as a collision, and then when you try to jump off, it's very easy to awkwardly stick back onto it because of the weird controls, and that counts as yet another collision. This can happen upwards of like 5 consecutive times in a row. It's pain, just absolute pain. It's something like this where I can appreciate the fact that sticking to walls is mapped to a button in Spider-Man 2. But then would hitting a wall without actually sticking to it count as a collision in and of itself? Maybe we're better off without that answer. We're not quite done yet. Spider-Man, the movie, the game, starring Tobey Maguire, still has a decent amount of extra content that you can unlock throughout the game. My personal favorite addition are the cheat codes the game has to offer, and boy oh boy, there are a lot of them. There is also a handful of stuff you can unlock in this area called the Secret Store, like some interesting concept art and some mini-games you can play whenever you want as well. The cheat codes in this game are by far one of my favorite aspects about it, I'll say again. You've of course got your classics such as infinite health, infinite ammo, or webbing in this case. Unlocking all levels, you get the idea. But codes like these ones aren't quite the reason why I adore this entire concept so much. Before I get into it, I just have to say, to every game developer out there in the entire world, please, and I cannot stress this enough, please start putting this nonsense back into mainstream video games. Nobody does it anymore, it's horrific. Every shitty 2 out of 10 game out there would go up to at least a 4 out of 10 minimum in my opinion, if they had some stupid ass fun cheat codes to mess around with. They genuinely enhance the experience for everyone involved. Anyway, back to my main point. Some of my fondest memories of playing this game as a kid were when I was screwing around with the cheat codes. I would go onto a website called GameWinners.com, which, in addition to being a forum and news site for video games, also contained a monolithic library of cheat codes for pretty much every game that had them. Lo and behold, Spider-Man's codes were on there. I even remember I would take little slips of paper and write the codes I found down in pencil, because my parents would get upset if I had both the computer and the Xbox on at the same time. So writing codes down was really my only option to have immediate access to them while playing the game. What's funnier though is that I do still own the exact same copy of the game from back then, and upon opening the game case, I did find one of the actual slips of paper I just mentioned. It's like a little time capsule. That said though, looking at it now, I have absolutely no clue why I wrote down any of these codes in particular. The only one of these 3 that really makes sense to me is organic webbing, since this is the code that gives you infinite webbing. Lord knows why I would need that. But the outliers here are Real Hero and Captain Stacy. Real Hero lets you play as a police officer, and Captain Stacy lets you play as, well, Captain Stacy. I don't exactly know why I needed to see these codes in effect specifically, but I think at the time, cheat codes were a pretty new concept to me, so I wanted to really just check them all out. That said, the police officer and Captain Stacy are far from the only characters you can play around with. For example, putting in the code Girl Next Door lets you play as Mary Jane, and if you enter in Herman Schultz, you can play around as Shocker, which, if you didn't know, his real name is Herman Schultz. There are also some weirder character codes, like being able to play as Uncle Ben's killer, which is kinda fucked up if you really think about it.
I'm gonna tear you to pieces.
How you like me now?
At the end of the day though, whichever character you do happen to go with, it's always pretty funny to see them swinging around and doing Spider-Man shit. Also, as a bit of a side note, I want to go back to the Mary Jane cheat code I mentioned for a minute, since I discovered something, kinda wacky. So, the way the cheat code characters work is you play as them throughout the entirety of the game, minus most of the cutscenes. The only exception to the lack of cutscenes is the ending, after defeating the Green Goblin for the final time. The cutscene plays out and ends with a kiss between Spider-Man and Mary Jane. And the reason this is an exception is because this is the only cutscene that will play, and will have Spider-Man replaced with the character you were playing as. You can probably see where this is going, but if you have the Mary Jane code activated, you will instead be greeted with a scene of Mary Jane kissing herself. Alright? Now, I personally don't care, I think it's kind of funny, but I guess what ended up happening was a bunch of parents saw this back when the game was new, and they were like, uh-oh, they put the gay in my Spider-Man game. And I guess it became big enough of a problem for Treyarch to actually remove the ability to play as Mary Jane from later versions of the game. Times sure were different back in 2002. Cheat codes do not stop there though, no sir. There are lots of other stupid and fun ones besides changing what character you play as, so let's go over a few of them. One of my personal favorites has to be the code goes to your head, which gives you a giant head and also feet, for some reason. But really, big head modes were honestly just a weird trend the early 3D era of video games followed for some reason or another. I couldn't tell you why. From what I can tell, it started with GoldenEye for the Nintendo 64, where it was named DK mode, and I guess because GoldenEye ended up being so popular, certain games followed suit, and Spiderman ended up being one of them. That's just my guess anyway. On the opposite end of the spectrum, however, putting in the code SpiderBite makes Spider-Man tiny, so that's a lot of fun. It even adjusts Spider-Man's hitboxes to be the right size too, it's not just a cosmetic change. It makes enemies a lot worse at punching you, that's for sure. There's also another code called Under the Mask, and if you enter that in, it actually lets you play the entire game from a first-person perspective. And yeah, it works, but like, I just... But something else that definitely enhances the experience overall is the ability to combine codes. You can have a big-headed Mary Jane, or a tiny little Shocker. God, I love video games. And I know I just demonstrated how horrible the first person is, but you can combine SpiderBite and Under the Mask, and it will actually give you the correct camera perspective for Tiny Spider-Man. I just think that's a fun little detail. I could seriously go on and on about this stuff, as there are plenty of codes left that I haven't even mentioned here. But if I did that, we would be here for another 20 minutes, so let's move on to what is more or less the last thing I want to show off about this game before giving my final thoughts. Spider-Man, the movie, the game, has one final little fun bit that I'd like to shed some light on before I finish up here. It's a little store menu that you can buy things in, aptly named the Secret Store, and it works in two ways. One way is to just beat the game on varying difficulties. Doing so on easy will unlock a couple of items, but other items require you to beat the game on normal or hard. The second way to unlock stuff is through buying items with in-game points, which you collect passively while playing throughout the game anyway, so you were kind of killing two birds with one stone regardless, which I think is pretty neat. That said, once you have completed the game and accumulated your fair share of points, you can go to the Secret Store and find out what you've unlocked. The first couple of items are pretty basic and only require you to beat the game on easy difficulty to be unlocked. One lets you play as Peter Parker in his normal clothes, which is pretty fun, and the other lets you play the entire game in the wrestler Spidey suit that makes an appearance in the first couple of levels, and the early parts of the movie, naturally. If you beat the game on normal difficulty, however, you can unlock a brand new suit based off of an unused concept of Spider-Man's suit for the first movie, drawn by comic book artist Alex Ross. I'm actually a really big fan of the look of this suit. It kind of makes me wish it did make it to the final version of the movie. Though you have to admit, the suit we did end up getting is iconic these days, so I can't really complain. What's especially interesting about the Alex Ross suit is equipment that actually changes the look of the Green Goblin as well, with himself being based off of another Alex Ross concept. I'm a big fan of this design as well, and I'm really glad the two of them ended up getting the opportunity to be used in some way. While we're on the subject of unused material, I wanted to show another version of the Green Goblin suit that I found while doing research for this part of the video. This one actually made its way past being just a concept and even has some footage of it being tested. You can see this one is less of a mask and more of a full prosthetic face, with the actor's mouth being incorporated and everything. It's a super interesting design and I actually really love it. It's something I definitely wish we could have seen more of. Anyway, we're nearly done here, so since we're talking about the Green Goblin anyway, I wanted to talk about one last thing. The final unlockable item in the Secret Store. The way you gain access to it is by beating the story mode on hero difficulty, which is, not the easiest thing you could be asked to do. But yeah, if you do manage to pull that off, you will be treated to what I think is one of the coolest things in this entire game. You are given access to a fully playable version of the Green Goblin. No restrictions, no bullshit, just straight up Goblin gameplay that is identical to how he acts in his boss appearances within the game. You can use the glider in the same fashion as web swinging. It has infinite use, you can use it in every single level within the game with absolutely no restrictions, and it's super responsive and fun to control, more so than the web swinging in some cases. As for combat, it is honestly just about as fleshed out as it is while playing as Spider-Man. You have an entirely unique list of combo moves, and the ability to use the glider's weapons such as the machine gun, carpet bombs, whatever this is, and you can lob 4 different types of bombs all over the place, and even use the razor bats. It's really an entirely different experience compared to playing as Spider-Man. You can even play as him in the minigames like the Big Brawl and the Obstacle Course. The only area you cannot use the Goblin is Pinhead Bowling, which I guess makes sense because the glider doesn't actually knock thugs over the way web swinging can. As a bonus, the Green Goblin is actually fully voiced, albeit not by Willem Dafoe unfortunately, which is more or less where the catch comes in. You see, the Green Goblin you get to play as is not the Norman Osborn original Green Goblin, but rather you play as Harry Osborn, assuming the Goblin identity in an effort to investigate the death of his father, Norman, whose death, of course, happens at the end of Spider-Man's story. The dialogue in each level is actually changed to reflect the difference of playing as the Green Goblin, with the thugs and bosses having slightly different lines so as to no longer refer to Spider-Man.
He's still chasing us, but this is our chance. He won't be able to fly around as much down here. Let's take him out!
The character change is also reflected in the Green Goblin boss fights, which yes, do still play a vital part in Harry's story. The wiki for this game claims the Goblin in these sequences is actually the Hobgoblin, but I am personally skeptical if that's really who he's supposed to be. The only thing he really reveals himself is that he was hired by Norman Osborn for some reason or another. But we'll roll with the Hobgoblin thing for now. The Hobgoblin is still voiced by Willem Dafoe, but his voice is pitch shifted to be way deeper and he has entirely new dialogue throughout all of his appearances.
Now this is just nonsense. I think I'll find a new playground.
At the end of the day, it's not a huge change, but it works for what it is. Overall, the Green Goblin gameplay is an absolute joy to play, and at some points is even better than playing as Spider-Man if I'm being honest. It's really commendable the lengths that the developers went to in order to make this feel as unique as possible, in spite of it being a wholly optional experience. Great job, guys! As the subtitle for this section of the video points out, I thank each and every one of those of you who have stuck it out all the way until the end of this tirade of Spider-Man fanboying. I really love this game a lot, and I'm glad I finally put together some kind of video talking about it. I've been meaning to do this for a long time. If there's anything I hope you take away from this, it's that if you haven't tried this game before, and if you have the means to play it, I think it is worth playing at least once. There's a lot to like about this game, from the large variety of gameplay mechanics, the different take on the movie's story, and of course the overall appeal of Spider-Man as a character. I think a lot of people will enjoy this if they give it a shot, even if it is a bit dated by today's standards. I might talk about the Spider-Man 3 game as well at some point. As a matter of fact, I was going to talk about both 1 and 3 in this video originally, but I figured I shouldn't get too overzealous. This is my first time doing something of this scale after all. I do hope you enjoyed it though. I had a lot of fun doing this, and it's very likely I'll do more of these types of videos in the future. Whether it be Spider-Man 3 or something entirely different, only time will tell. Anyway, that's it from me. If you liked what you saw, feel free to check out some of my other videos, it would really mean a lot. I'm also on Twitch if that's something you're into. I try to stream as often as I can, with a variety of games old and new. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all soon.